Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I got a few things that I just took out of my freezer. My mom visited the farmer's market the other day and noticed how some of the people buying heads of cabbage were tearing off the outer few leaves and just chucking them into a box that was on the floor there. And she asked the guy, "Hey, this stuff is trash, isn't it? Can I take it?" And he was like, "Yeah, sure, grab it." So what I got was a huge bag, probably a good 4 or 5 pounds worth of just cabbage leaves. And I didn't have really room in my freezer to freeze all of it, but what I did was I grabbed just a handful of stuff. Oh, you can hear it, it's still frozen. Threw it in my freezer about 10 minutes ago and it just flash froze. Because it's paper thin, it's going to freeze 1, 2, 3. And I don't know, it seems like a lot, but it isn't. The bins that we're checking in on, I had a little mishap last time we checked in on them. I thought I was feeding other bins that I had come down here to feed, and then I pulled out my 2 European nightcrawler bins that had just been fed 3 days before. And as I'm going through the bin, both bins actually, I noticed, something's not right here. How is it that I've got all these leftovers in here, especially of stuff that would have been normally eaten 1, 2, 3. So these 2 European nightcrawler bins that you see right here on the bench in front of me. Let me tip the camera down. These bins we've been feeding the way you see them here on the bench at once, because normally I just bring bin 1 out, feed it, bring bin 2 number 2 out and feed it. But with these bins here, we've been feeding them side by side at once, almost treating it as if we were feeding one large bin. So we're going to get back to that same routine again today. And the reason these bins haven't been checked in on recently, it's been 15 days now since the last check-in, was because they got fed 2 times in a row, very quickly, one after the other. And it did seem like if we wanted things to be working nicely in these bins, we should really allow for a little bit of time for that sort of glut of food to get consumed. So we figured we'd wait at least a couple weeks, and that's what we've done at this point. 15 days. And I've got a couple pieces of replacement top covering newspaper, which I like to do out here, as you can see. And besides newspaper, the other thing that you see out here on the top coverings is the coffee filter, which is just my way of indicating where we last fed. I've got replacements for these as well. So my idea here today was to use these nicely seasoned chunks of paper as supplementary bedding down in the worm bins, replacing those top covering papers with new stuff. And in the case of this bin here, you might have noticed how the plastic covering was cinched in a little bit to allow a little bit extra moisture to escape the bin, because I think it was seen as being possibly a little bit damp. So I think maybe that helped a little bit, for the past 2 weeks of allowing for a little extra moisture to escape over there on the edges. The bubble wrap that was covering things here did actually make its way out to the far edges, but the 2 side edges, the bubble wrap just isn't wide enough to cover entirely, allowing for a little bit of airflow anyway in both systems. But here in this system, you could see we allowed for just a little bit extra airflow. So all this stuff that's just been sitting out here idle on the top surface, sort of dry, has probably not seen a whole lot of worm traffic for quite some time now. This stuff I generally want to see back in service, and I'm setting it aside so we can include it as well down in the feeding area as supplementary bedding, so that it can get rehydrated and let the worms get back to work on it. And there was also a good bit of bedding added to the last feeding in the form of just crumpled up newspaper. So I am curious to see how that stuff's coming along. I mean, in these bins we've just been sort of going right across, almost trying to treat them as a single system, and I'm I'm going to kind of keep to that today. So I figured we would just sort of open up the entire feeding area of both bins at once so that we can go through that whole sort of big bin simulation here. Because what you're seeing here is pretty much the largest containers I have. Well, you know, not largest, because I have a couple bigger ones. I've got a grow bag that I usually run outdoors, but it's indoors right now, and that's bigger than this. And I've got a Vermibag Mini, which regrettably has been just sitting idle for quite a while and really should get back to work, housing some worms one of these days. And I keep saying that over and over, but never seem to get around to doing it. One of these days I will. The last time I ran the Vermibag Mini, it ran worms like what you're seeing here, the European nightcrawlers. And I just thought that maybe the next commissioning of the Vermibag Mini might run somewhat different types of worms. I've got, you know, red wiggler worms, I've got Indian blue worms, I've got African nightcrawler worms. I got a variety of different types of worms in my collection down here in my wormery, so my idea was to use something other than what was running in the Vermibag last time. And you know, the one thing we didn't really do was pick through what we excavated from the feeding zone to see if we can maybe focus some of the leftovers that we have down in there back down into the feeding area as well. So in addition to this collected stuff we put in the corner, the dry stuff, it might be beneficial to see if we can scrape up some of these leftovers we encountered too. So over here I found a banana peel and a corn cob, a couple pieces of corn cob, but a lot of the stuff that came out is over on this side. There's another banana peel. Here's some of that newspaper that got crumbled up and placed down into the feeding zone last time as bedding. It did seem to me like the newspaper we placed in there as bedding last time would probably last and not require replenishment in today's check-in. So that's the reason I figured we could just skip adding extra bedding today and just reuse what we have already down here in the system. Okay. The stuff we're going to try to reconstitute as the feeding zone is plentiful over here. Banana peels, I think, are still holding out pretty good, even after 15 days, because I think that was part of what we fed last time. I think watermelon might have been part of it too, but I'm not 100% certain. That's the sort of thing after 14 days, 15 days, I mean. I don't think we're going to see any leftovers of. Another piece of corn cob. So yeah, we've got quite a bit of stuff over here to include with the cabbage leaves. Let's see what else we can recycle from this little pile here. I'm just trying to be really careful here because I'm operating extremely close to the top edge here, and I just don't want to have stuff flying over the edge all over the place, because why be messy if you have to? It's always easier to keep things clean rather than being messy and needing to clean up afterwards, right? At least that's my point of view on things in general. So maybe we could have been a little bit more methodical in excavating the feeding zone and forward thinking, but I was just curious to see how things were doing down in here. Things seem to be working quite nicely. The banana peels as leftovers are perfectly normal. Not finding any watermelon is also perfectly normal. Cantaloupe melon, on the other hand, that's what you see here, is the rind of some cantaloupe melon. That predates the previous feeding, or even the feeding before. That was only 3 days prior. That stuff, they'll usually nibble off the nice soft stuff, the nice melon off the rind, but the tougher outer skin with that kind of weird pattern to it, that stuff will typically stick around too. And it'll all go over time. It's just a somewhat slower composting material. Okay. So, like I said, all the stuff that we piled up here I think is just going to go right back down I just wanted to try to separate it from all this other stuff up here. Here's another banana peel. And another corn cob. I was just being a little bit hasty, I suppose. I guess after 2+ weeks of not being in here, I was anxious to see how things are coming along. So at this point, we're not going to get too particular about how to arrange the leftover food and bedding that we encountered on the way. Just going to plop it down in the hole, trying to make sure we've got most of it. I think we've got most of it. And let's not forget that we're going to be replacing all the top covering stuff, so the other stuff we're putting down in here is also recycled paper, and that too is going to bring up the amount of bedding down here in the feeding area, and I think it's quite plenty. Alright, so the other feeding zone indicator and the other top covering newspaper goes in here. Alright, so let's first drop in all this old stuff, and we'll cover it with those recycled bedding bits. Get all this dry stuff in here. Now we're definitely starting to bring the level of both feeding zones up pretty good. Before we cover up here though, I do want to explore the outer edges of both systems too. And as we till up what's on the outer edges, that too will start to bring the overall level of things up too. And that'll also provide us with a good bit of material with which we can cover up neatly at the end and try to level things off. So here's 2 pieces of paper and 2 pieces of paper, 1 coffee filter on each side. So now I think we can start bringing in this cabbage. Sometimes I'll bring down, a little tray worth of food, and I could tell from the weight of it that it's a pretty significant amount. Here, it's not all that much, I must say. So I don't know if we'll be waiting another 15 days between now and the next check-in. Let's start adding some over here too, so I don't skew the portion in favor of one or the other system. Just want to make sure I'm being fair. And the only reason I gave this stuff a chance to really quickly freeze before getting put into the worm bins is because I am fairly certain that the simple act of freezing the foods and then just the subsequent thawing of the foods afterwards helps boost the speed at which the materials are able to break down. And then I guess just in the interest of giving the worms a little extra help breaking down their foods, I sometimes add a little bit of this pulverized eggshell to the feedings. And that's just the grit that I use. Some people use, pulverized crustacean shell, rock dust. Anything like that would work. Sand. All that sort of stuff would work just fine as grit in your worm bins. For me, it's just eggshell is just, the material of choice because it's just what's on hand and plentiful. So I think we're bumping into just a few additional little scraps of leftover food and stuff that we excavated from the feeding zone, which I've tried to center down in the middle, but I think we've got it all here. And we've leveled off nicely. Here's another piece of corn cob, so let me jam that down there too. I keep smelling citrus, and I think that's what might be right here that I just tried to jam down a little bit lower. Little piece of lime right here. Such a nice, pleasant odor. And other than that, I don't smell anything really. There's really usually no smell at all to a worm bin. This was kind of nice because sometimes I feel a little bit bad placing a whole bunch of really frozen, cold stuff in on top of the worms. But here that feeding had a chance to thaw out almost entirely. Some of it was a little bit crunchy and breaking, but most of it had already thawed out and was softened up, and now that it's just surrounded with room temperature materials, it's probably not even frozen anymore. for the most part. So here too, another piece of banana stem. I think we've managed to submerge most of the stuff that would classify as food. So before we come in with the replacement feeding zone indicators, I've got one for each system as well as the replacement newspapers. I'm still interested in doing what I mentioned earlier, which is just to do a quick tilling up of the outer far edges in each system. And I was starting to wonder where all the worms are, because they didn't seem to be too jazzed about what was going on down in the feeding area. But it would seem like out here on this edge we're finding a good number of them. And the material is starting to get a little bit compacted and dense, but that usually doesn't seem to put the worms off too much. You saw how many worms were hanging out in this stuff. I just like the idea of aerating and loosening the material. Some people have sort of the stance on that, which says, you know, throw the food in, leave the worms be, out in nature, nobody's tilling up their environment, it's not necessary. But I also don't think it causes any harm to the worms, so I see no problem doing it. So since it's my preference, I do like to do it, and I've actually kind of convinced myself there's also certain benefits to it as well. Yep, here too, lots of worms hanging out. So now the two edges closer to the camera, further from me, the ones that we're tilling up now are the two edges of the bins that are facing into the room, as opposed to the two edges that are closer to me. Those are the two edges that are up against the wall, where I believe a little bit of the outside winter air sneaks in and might make things a little bit chillier. So a lot of times I just wonder if the worms are drawn to the edge of the bin that's out there that we just tilled up. Might be caused by the slightly warmer and more hospitable conditions over there. So I don't know if we're going to see quite as many when we till up the outer edges over here. These are the European nightcrawlers, which are much more tolerant of cooler temperatures than the, say for example, some of the more tropical type worms like the African nightcrawlers or the Indian blue worms. So here we're seeing almost just as many worms hanging out in the far edges of the bin. Not particularly put off by the fact that maybe there's a little bit cooler temperatures out here, which is kind of cool. Cool. I didn't mean to say it that way, but it did sort of work out nicely. Alright, we're leveling here. Let's give this bin a quick stir over here too on the outer edge. I do remember during one of our check-ins, this particular outer edge that I'm tilling up right now got skipped by accident. I sort of started into a skimming of the top surface, and then I distracted myself and didn't get around to tilling up the outer edge. I think it's been tilled up though since then. But just in case it hasn't, and this is the first time it's being tilled up in quite a while, then it's good. Didn't feel too dense or anything like that, so I don't think it was too long ago that we actually did get back in here and till up that outer edge too. And now we're level here as well. And I guess, you know, the reason we had left the plastic, at least on this one, a little bit more cinched in to allow for a little bit of drying in this bin. I really see no difference between these two bins in terms of moisture. Maybe there is just a little bit more moisture here than is needed, because when I start to see a lot of moisture sticking to my glove, that's usually a sign that there's possibly a little bit more moisture in the system than is absolutely necessary. But the worms definitely like it, so I'm not opposed to leaving it that way. So I think when we get around to replacing the plastic coverings, they're going to go back on as thoroughly as they can, laying flat over as much of the surface as possible to help protect the system from any further drying, which I don't think is going to be necessary any longer. So we've now marked both bins, showing us where the last feeding was applied. And if you're a regular on my channel, you'll already know that I typically feed almost all my systems right down the middle, so it's no mystery in most cases, although I do have certain bins where I'm trying to migrate the worms out of their finished castings. So in that case, the feeding is being applied only to the edge of the bin that I'm trying to corral the worms over to. And then I've also got my mixed population of worms where I'm also running the bin just as sort of an experiment in that continuous flow wedge pattern, which also by its nature gets feedings only on one side, leaving the opposite end of the bin to house where all the pretty much finished castings are, even opening the door to potentially having that edge of the bin harvested once in a while for finished castings. So that's it. We're done here. And I think I got the right bins today. So I've got a few things I gotta take care of getting cleaned up and put away, but I'm not gonna waste your time with that because that's boring. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.